It was just after midnight, specifically around 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, when Kyle Lawson was woken up by his cell phone ringing. He was in bed with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, and the sound cut right through the quiet of the night. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 26-year-old Brandon. That was a little strange, a call this late, but he answered it. Kyle put the phone to his ear, but before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through, frantic and rushed. He said he needed help right now. And then he launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle that he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this highway is a classic West Texas road, just 2 lanes stretching out into what feels like a whole lot of nothing. It's desolate, especially in the middle of the night. There aren't many lights, not much traffic, just open, empty country. And according to Brandon, he wasn't alone out there. He said there were 3 men and they were chasing him. To make things worse, he told Kyle that his truck was about to run out of gas. He was on fumes. His voice was high-pitched with panic. He was practically begging Kyle. He needed him to bring a gas can out to him to meet him somewhere along the highway so he could refuel and get away from these guys who were on his tail. He stressed that Kyle had to be secretive about it, that he couldn't let the other men see him. As Kyle listened to all of this, lying there in his bed, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't picturing a high-speed chase with dangerous men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just deep, heavy annoyance. He was almost certain that there were no 3 men. He was sure that his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a paranoid, drug-induced hallucination. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. It was a struggle he'd been fighting for a while. For the past 6 months, he'd actually been doing really well. He'd been clean, he was working hard, and he was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. He seemed to be turning a corner, and the whole family was proud of him. But just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. He did the opposite. He pleaded with his brother, telling him, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words hadn't gotten through. He was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped, Brandon had found a way to get drugs anyway. Because ever since that phone call 2 days ago, Brandon's behavior had been erratic and unpredictable. He just wasn't acting like himself. In fact, the only reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this because he'd spoken to his parents earlier in the evening. The plan was for Brandon to drive to their parents' house to cool off for the night, to get some space. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior at home. So him being on this specific road at this specific time made sense in that context. But the story about being chased by 3 men, that part didn't make sense at all. Not in the real world, anyway. So, Kyle knew his brother was almost certainly high. And he also knew that trying to reason with him in this state was a waste of time. Telling him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high, you need to go to mom and dad's house," would be pointless. Brandon wouldn't hear it. He was in his own reality right now. So Kyle shifted his strategy. He didn't argue. He just tried to calm his brother down, to soothe the panic in his voice. He used a low, steady tone, trying to be the anchor in Brandon's storm. But it wasn't working. Brandon didn't calm down. If anything, he got more agitated, more anxious. He kept talking about the 3 men, saying they were getting closer, that he was running out of time. The desperation in his voice was escalating with every word. Finally, Kyle just had to ask the question that was hanging in the air. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's happening here? As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real, that he was in serious trouble. He went right back to begging Kyle to come help him to bring the gas can so he could escape. "Please, Kyle, you have to hurry. They're gonna get me. Just bring the gas. Please, man, come on." At this point, Kyle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was no point in continuing this conversation. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He was a husband and a father. He couldn't spend his life babysitting his younger brother through self-inflicted crises. But at the same time, underneath the frustration, Kyle loved his brother. They were very close. And even though he was 99% sure there was no real danger from these imaginary men, there was still a tiny sliver of doubt. And what if Brandon was in danger from himself? What if he crashed his truck or wandered off into the dark? Kyle sighed. He knew what he had to do. He made a decision. He told Brandon, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be right there." Then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark and empty highway, 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife had insisted on coming. She hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother, especially not when he was in such a strange state of mind. So now, the whole family was out on this rescue mission. As Kyle drove, he scanned the darkness on both sides of the road. This part of Texas is wide open. Even at night, you can see for a long way. The landscape is mostly flat plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small trees. It's the kind of place where a set of headlights or taillights would be visible for miles. It would be very easy to spot another vehicle. But Kyle saw nothing. There were no other cars. There was no truck that looked like Brandon's. There was certainly no sign of 3 other men in pursuit. The road was completely empty. He just kept driving, peering out into the darkness, checking the fields on either side just in case Brandon had somehow veered off the road. That seemed like a real possibility given the state he was in. But there was nothing. Then, finally, way up ahead, he saw it. A dark shape parked on the shoulder, half on the pavement and half on the dirt. It was a truck. The lights were off. It wasn't running. It was just sitting there, silent in the night. As Kyle got closer, he could see that it was his brother's truck. He'd found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her to stay in the car with their son, to lock the doors. He said he was just going to go over and talk to Brandon. In his mind, he was picturing Brandon sitting in the driver's seat, high as a kite, waiting for him. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go to their parents' house, and this whole bizarre night would be over. The fact that there were no other cars around just confirmed his theory. The 3 men were a fantasy. But when Kyle walked across the highway and got to Brandon's truck, he peered through the driver's side window and his heart dropped a little. There was no one inside. The truck was empty. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense. Kyle was confused. On the entire drive out there, Brandon had been calling him repeatedly, call after call, his voice getting more and more frantic. "Hurry up, Kyle! You gotta get here! They're gaining on me! Bring the gas, man! I'm in trouble!" And now, Kyle was finally here, standing right next to the truck, and his brother was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said on the phone that he was leaving the truck. Where could he possibly have gone? Kyle started looking around the immediate area. He even crouched down and looked under the truck, feeling a bit ridiculous. Was his brother hiding? As he was standing there, trying to process this strange scene, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now deeply annoyed and confused, answered it with a sharp, "Brandon, where are you?" Brandon's voice came back, calm for the first time that night. He just said, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. No, you're not. I don't see you. Your truck is here, but you're not. But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights coming down the highway toward them. The vehicle was slowing down. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. A sheriff's deputy was pulling up to the scene. And as this was happening, as the police car was rolling to a stop right in front of him, Brandon's voice came through the phone with an urgent whisper. Run away from that cop. In that split second, Kyle realized something important. Brandon had to be close by. He had to be watching this whole scene unfold. He could see Kyle, he could see his truck, and he could see the deputy arriving. But Kyle was looking all around him, out into the flat, open fields, and there was simply nowhere to hide. The landscape was barren. There were a few scattered shrubs and some small trees far off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was getting furious. This whole thing was a ridiculous game. He knew why Brandon wanted him to run. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a drug charge. He was trying to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Kyle was already out here in the dead of night with his family in the car, trying to help his brother who was clearly not in his right mind. And now Brandon wanted him to run from the police? It was too much. Kyle was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the deputy had parked his cruiser and was walking over to Kyle, who was still standing next to his brother's abandoned truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He said he was responding to a 911 call from a truck driver who had reported a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. He asked Kyle if the truck belonged to him, if he was the one who needed help. Kyle knew he should tell the truth, but the instinct to protect his brother was strong. He couldn't just tell the deputy that his brother was likely high on meth, hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and also had a warrant for his arrest. So, he made up a story. He told the deputy that the truck belonged to his brother and that his brother had called him saying he'd run out of gas. He suggested that Brandon had probably started walking down the road to find a gas station. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove up and down the road a bit to look for Brandon. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Go ahead. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther north, away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's truck. Once he was sure he was far enough down the road that the deputy couldn't see him, Kyle pulled over again. He took out his phone and started calling his brother, over and over and over again, his anger growing with each unanswered call. But Brandon never picked up. At this point, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Kyle's 4-year-old son in the back seat was awake and crying. He was tired and scared. Kyle's wife was exhausted. And Kyle himself had reached his limit. He looked at his wife and said, "That's it. I'm done." Brandon was an adult. He had tried to come out and help, to get him out of whatever mess this was. But if Brandon didn't want to be found, if he wanted to hide in a field and play these games, then that was on him. Kyle had a family to take care of. He was going home. He turned the car around and drove back south, right past the spot where his brother's truck was still parked. Deputy Neal was still there, standing beside it, presumably waiting for Brandon to return. Kyle didn't stop. He just kept driving, heading home to put his son and this crazy night to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some wild story to explain everything. He was frustrated, but he wasn't yet truly worried. A little while after Kyle and his family drove past, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night either. He'd done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing suspicious inside. But importantly, there was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were the things a person would take with them if they had indeed run out of gas and decided to walk for help. The story Kyle had told seemed to hold up. So, Deputy Neal figured Brandon was fine, just off on foot somewhere. He had other calls to respond to. So, he reached into the truck, turned on the hazard lights so it would be visible to other drivers, locked the doors, and then he got back in his own car and left. The next morning, around 8 o'clock, Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 on his patrol. He wanted to check if Brandon had eventually made it back to his truck. But when he got to the spot, the truck was still there, sitting exactly as he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, a little bit of concern started to creep in for Deputy Neal. It was one thing to be gone for a few hours in the middle of the night. It was another to still be gone well into the next morning. It was possible something bad had happened to Brandon while he was on foot. Maybe he got lost, or fell and hurt himself, or maybe he was even hit by a car. Deputy Neal decided he needed to follow up to try and find Brandon and make sure he was okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up contact information for Brandon Lawson. But as soon as he walked through the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from a woman named Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, and the story she told was very different from the simple ran-out-of-gas story that Kyle had given him. Ledessa explained that she and Brandon had been fighting. She confirmed that he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off on the night he disappeared. But he never made it to his parents' house. And he never came back home to her either. No one in the family had seen or heard from him since that night. They had all been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. Brandon was officially missing. Hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and, frankly, pretty angry. He felt like Kyle had lied to him, that he deliberately downplayed the seriousness of the situation. His first move was to go and talk to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full, unfiltered story. And it quickly became clear that the family hadn't been trying to hide a crime. They had been trying to protect Brandon from his warrant and from himself. They genuinely believed, just like Kyle did, that this was another drug-induced episode and that he would eventually turn up. But now that he was truly gone, their fear was real. They told the police everything they knew, including his history of drug use. They were begging the police to find him. And so, a massive search was launched. For the next 4 days, Deputy Neal led a huge effort covering the area around where Brandon's truck was found on Highway 277. They had teams on foot, they used search dogs, they even had helicopters in the air. Some of the search teams used thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat, making it possible to find someone even if they are hiding or unconscious. But despite scouring this vast, open area, they found absolutely nothing. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. They also interviewed people who lived or owned property in the general area. They asked if anyone had seen a man walking, or a strange truck, or maybe even the 3 men Brandon had claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. Faced with a total lack of evidence, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete absence of any sign of him, he must have fled. They decided he was not a missing person in the traditional sense, he was a person who had chosen to disappear. He wasn't in the area because he had left on his own terms. And with that, the official search was called off. It seemed like an open and shut case of a man running from his problems. That is, until Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, walked into the sheriff's station with a piece of paper that changed everything. It was August 13th, 2013, 4 days after Brandon had disappeared. The official search had just been terminated. An officer at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa, who looked distraught. She told him that she'd been so worried, she had started digging into their shared cell phone records looking for any clue. And she had found something that terrified her. She slid a printed-out call log across the desk and pointed to a single entry. The officer saw that it was a record of Brandon's calls from the night he went missing. In between all the frantic calls to his brother Kyle, there was another one, made at 12:50 in the morning. Brandon had called 911. Ledessa explained why this was so chilling. Brandon was terrified of the police. He had a warrant. He would do anything to avoid them. She knew that he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. For him to voluntarily call 911 himself, she said, meant that he must have believed his life was in immediate mortal danger. He must have been out of all other options. It made no sense that he would call for help and then seemingly run away from it. This was a complete shock to everyone at the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they believed the only 911 call had come from a trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. They had no idea that Brandon himself had also called for help. It turned out that the local 911 dispatch center was a small, underfunded operation. In the confusion of the night, someone had simply failed to pass along the information about Brandon's call to the responding deputies. It was a critical error. Now that they knew about it, they had to hear it. They contacted the dispatch center and got a copy of the audio recording. When they played it, a chill went down their spines. First, Brandon's voice. He did not sound like someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in the middle of a life-or-death situation. He was breathless and panicked. But the second thing, the most disturbing thing, was that if you listened very, very closely, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background, on Brandon's end of the line, right before the call disconnected. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice came through, choppy and fast. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A state trooper is pushing guys over. Right here, going toward Abilene on both sides. His words were jumbled, hard to understand. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased into the woods. Some guys, the dispatcher, confused, said, okay, now run that by me one more time. Brandon then seemed to be talking to someone else, not the dispatcher. He said, we're not talking to him. Then, to the dispatcher again, I accidentally ran into them. The dispatcher asked, you ran into them. Okay. Then Brandon said something truly chilling. Got the first guy. The dispatcher asked, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replied, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher tried to clarify, okay. Is anybody hurt? But there was no response. Just silence. Hello? 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 The line was dead. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This might be a homicide. The reference to being chased, the other voice, the cryptic phrase, got the first guy, it all painted a much darker picture. The search, which had just been called off, was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured countless, but they found nothing. Not a single clue. He was just gone. Eventually, the case went cold again. The authorities may have moved on, but Brandon's family never did. Ledessa hired 2 different private investigators over the years. They conducted their own extensive searches, not just around Highway 277, but all over the state, following up on any potential lead. But they also came up empty. As the years went by, Brandon's disappearance became a well-known internet mystery featured on podcasts and television shows. Theories swirled. Maybe he was just high and wandered off, falling victim to the elements or wild animals. Maybe the 3 men were real and they had kidnapped and killed him. Or maybe the original police theory was right and he had successfully started a new life somewhere else. For 9 long years, there were only questions. Then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers, volunteers who had become fascinated with the case, decided to go out to Highway 277 one more time. They went back to that same area that had been searched by hundreds of people with dogs and helicopters and advanced technology. And while combing through a field right off the side of the highway, these volunteers found what all the others had missed. They found an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white sneakers. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, secured the area, and began their own meticulous search. Not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered it. A small fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. They belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally bring some answers. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location where his skull fragment was found was incredibly close to where his truck had been parked. It was in the primary search area, the very place that had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb again and again for years. How could everyone have missed it? Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open West Texas field. It's hard to imagine how the remains of a grown man, along with his clothing and bright white shoes, could have gone unnoticed for 9 years. So where does that leave us? We're left with 2 impossible-sounding scenarios. The first option is that for 9 years, hundreds of searchers, professional canine units, and helicopters with thermal cameras all somehow missed Brandon's body, which was lying right there in the open field where they were looking. That he was there the whole time, and everyone was simply blind to it. The second option is that he wasn't there. That during those initial searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if that's true, it raises even more questions. Where did he go after that 911 call? And, most disturbingly, how did his remains end up back in that field nearly a decade later? We can reconstruct his last known movements. He argued with Ledessa. He drove off, likely under the influence of drugs. His paranoia escalated until he believed men were chasing him. He called his brother for help. His truck ran out of gas. He got out and made a terrifying 911 call where he spoke of being chased and mentioned he got the first guy. He saw a deputy arrive and warned his brother to run. And then he vanished. 9 years later, a piece of him reappeared, almost exactly where his journey ended. The discovery of his remains gave his family a painful partial closure. They finally knew he was gone. But the how, the why, and the who, if there was a who, remain a profound and haunting mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. One morning in 2017, 25-year-old Watanabe Takuya walked through the front doors of Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't asking for help right away, but something about him immediately felt off. His skin was drenched in sweat from a fever. A deep headache pulsed behind his eyes with every step he took. And as he approached the check-in desk, he kept one hand tightly pressed against his right ear. Fluid was leaking from it. For most people, symptoms like that would have been terrifying. But Takuya mainly felt annoyed, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Takuya had a long and difficult history with a condition known as cholesteatoma. It's basically a non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal, and it can cause a lot of problems if it's not treated. When Takuya was just a teenager, he'd had to go through multiple surgeries to get these cysts removed. The doctors had worked hard to make sure they got every last bit of it so it wouldn't come back. And for nearly a decade, it seemed like they had succeeded. The surgeries had worked. The cysts were gone, and he had been able to live a normal life without constant ear problems. But then, about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, the old, familiar symptoms started to return. He noticed a constant drainage coming out of his right ear. It was a clear sign that the cyst was back. Initially, Takuya had tried to ignore it. He was busy with work and life, and the idea of going back to the hospital, of possibly facing another surgery, was something he just didn't want to deal with. He put it off, hoping it might just clear up on its own, even though deep down he knew that was unlikely. But now, with the fever and the pounding headache, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was pretty sure the recurring cyst had caused him to develop a nasty ear infection. That would explain why he felt so sick. And so, here he was, back at the hospital, hand pressed to his ear, feeling frustrated with himself for waiting so long. He walked up to the check-in desk and explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist. She listened patiently, nodded, and typed all his information into the computer. Seeing the state he was in, she quickly had him admitted to the emergency room. About half an hour passed. Takuya was now lying in a bed in the emergency room. The bright, sterile lights of the room were so intense they felt like they were stabbing into his eyes, making his headache even worse. So he just kept his eyes closed. But even with his eyes shut, he could hear the quiet sounds of the ER, and he sensed a doctor standing right beside his bed. He listened as the doctor began to go over the results of the initial tests they had run. The doctor's voice was calm and professional. He confirmed what Takuya had already suspected. Based on his medical history and the fluid clearly leaking from his ear, they were almost certain that his cyst had returned and had led to a severe ear infection. The doctor then mentioned that it was very likely Takuya would need another surgery to get rid of the cyst once and for all. But then the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He said they didn't want to operate just yet. There was a bigger, more immediate problem they had to deal with first. The preliminary blood tests had shown something alarming. The doctor explained that Takuya's ear infection had become so bad that the infection had actually started to spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development. It could lead to meningitis, permanent brain damage, and even death if it wasn't treated aggressively and immediately. When Takuya heard this, his annoyance and frustration were instantly replaced by a cold wave of shock and fear. This was far more serious than he had ever imagined. But more than anything, he just felt angry at himself. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that if he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago when the drainage first started, the infection likely never would have gotten this bad. He had tried to avoid the problem, and now it had spiraled into something life-threatening. It was too late for regrets now. Takuya forced his eyes open, squinting against the painful light, and looked at the doctor. He asked what they could do. The doctor laid out the plan. They were going to admit him to the hospital, not just keep him in the ER, and start him immediately on a very powerful intravenous dose of antibiotics to fight the infection that was threatening his brain. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still a patient in the hospital. He was lying flat on his back, being slowly rolled into the large, white, donut-shaped ring of a CT machine. The machine would scan the inside of his head, giving the doctors a detailed picture of what was going on. By this point, the powerful antibiotics had done their job. The dangerous infection around his brain had been cured, his fever was gone, and his headache had finally subsided. He was feeling much better. But despite this progress, one symptom remained. His ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but it was still happening on and off, a sign that the root problem was still there. And so, the doctors had ordered this CT scan. Their goal was to look inside Takuya's head, pinpoint the exact location and size of the suspected cyst, and map out exactly how they were going to approach the surgery to remove it. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes as the CT machine whirred and clicked around him, taking hundreds of images of his skull and brain. When it was finished, a nurse helped him out of the machine and led him back to his hospital room to wait. A little while later, one of the hospital doctors came into his room holding a folder with some papers inside. The doctor told Takuya that based on the results of the CT scan, he had some good news. Takuya actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a moment, Takuya felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. He had been mentally preparing himself for another operation, and the news that it wasn't necessary was incredible. But that happy feeling only lasted for a second. He saw the doctor's expression shift. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a deeply troubled look. The doctor then explained the reason why he didn't need surgery for a cyst. It was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem, the actual cause of all his symptoms, was something much, much worse. The doctor pulled an image from the stack of papers and handed it to Takuya. It was a cross-section from his CT scan. When Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he was seeing. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It is a mysterious and devastating illness where the body's own systems, for no known reason, begin to break down and absorb its own bone tissue. In Takuya's case, the bones of his skull were literally disappearing, dissolving away almost like an ice cube melting in the sun. And that fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks, it wasn't from an infection. It was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that cushions the brain, which was now flowing out through the holes that were forming in his skull. Unfortunately, then and now, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is try to manage the symptoms and patch the damage as it occurs. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. Surgeons went in and used a special kind of biomedical glue to literally plug up the holes that were forming in his skull. Amazingly, the procedure seemed to work. Takuya's doctors monitored him closely for any further bone loss and fluid leakage. As of his most recent publicly released checkup in 2018, he appeared to be doing quite well. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared in their house in Madison, Wisconsin. With a sigh of frustration, Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes from the holder by the sink and threw them straight into the garbage can. Then he picked up a bottle of disinfectant spray and went to work, spraying the counters, the sink, the faucet, the mirror, basically every single surface he could see, and began wiping everything down with paper towels. Dan was doing this deep clean because his entire family, himself, his wife, and their 3 young children all had strep throat. Their family doctor had explained that the best way to get rid of it for good was a 2-pronged attack. Everybody had to take a full course of antibiotics, and they had to deep clean the house from top to bottom to get rid of any lingering bacteria that might have caused the infection. However, as Dan scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt a deep sense of frustration. This was not the first time his family had gone through this exact routine. This was not the second or third time either. Over the past 4 months, his entire family had come down with strep throat a staggering 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took, or how many times they threw out their toothbrushes and deep cleaned the entire house, it felt like the sickness always found a way to come back. It was a miserable, unending cycle. This was especially baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist. He understood bacteria and how infections spread better than most people. He had already gone through a mental checklist of every possible source for this recurring infection. He checked at his own workplace and his wife's, but nobody else was getting sick. He checked with his kids' school and their daycare, and again, no other children or staff members were repeatedly getting strep. So he knew the infection couldn't be coming from any of those places. This just didn't make any sense. If the source wasn't outside the home, it had to be inside. But each of the 6 times they got sick, Dan and his wife had been incredibly thorough. They had systematically disinfected the entire house, going far beyond just the bathrooms. They cleaned every doorknob, every light switch, every toy, every surface they could think of. If there was strep bacteria hiding somewhere in the house, it surely should have been wiped out by now. It was as if the bacteria was somehow surviving their cleaning blitz, hiding in some place they had never thought to look. He just couldn't figure out where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully finished disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. On the counter was a small pile of prescription bottles, antibiotics for the whole family. Dan took his own dose and then prepared the doses for everyone else. He went to his daughter's room first. His 2 girls, who were 6 and 3 years old, were both lying in their beds, looking completely miserable and flushed with fever. He gave them their medicine before heading to his and his wife's bedroom. He found his wife sitting up in bed, and she was cuddling their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife her antibiotics and then looked down at his son. The little boy looked so small and so vulnerable, and it just broke Dan's heart to think about how many times this poor kid had been sick in his short life and how powerless he, as a father, felt to protect him. Dan felt like they were doing everything right. They were following the doctor's orders to the letter, but they were now on their 7th round of illness, and clearly nothing was changing. The advice they were getting wasn't helping. It felt like they were trapped in an awful nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But then, as Dan stood there feeling utterly defeated, he thought of something. His own mother was a retired pediatrician. She had decades of experience, and maybe, just maybe, she might have a different perspective or some advice that their current doctor hadn't considered. So, he sat down on the edge of the bed, took out his phone, and called his mom to explain the situation and ask for help. And it turned out Dan's mom did have a theory. It was a theory about where this relentless strep bacteria was coming from and how to finally get rid of it. But because Dan was a biologist and he understood how bacteria functioned on a scientific level, he knew that his mother's theory was, to put it mildly, out there. Most scientists and medical professionals would probably say that her idea was basically impossible. But at this point, after 6 bouts of strep throat, Dan and his family were desperate. They were ready to try anything, no matter how unconventional it seemed. So, Dan decided he would try to test his mother's theory. He began looking for an expert who could help him. But every expert Dan got in touch with, every lab and every doctor he called, turned him down as soon as they heard what his theory actually was. Nobody was prepared to even entertain the idea. It felt like he was so close to finding an answer, to finally curing his family of this horrible problem, but he was being blocked at every turn because the medical community wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside a hospital room sitting next to his wife. They were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, looking tiny and frail, hooked up to an IV drip and wearing an oxygen mask. She had gotten strep throat for the 7th time. And this time, it was much worse. She had gotten so sick that she had also developed pneumonia. At this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. For Dan, this was the absolute breaking point. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was convinced that the only way to save his children was to find someone, anyone, who would be willing to test his mother's theory. But they had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state of Wisconsin. Dan had no idea who else to turn to. As they sat there in the tense silence of the hospital room, watching their little girl fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him. She had an idea. What if, instead of asking established medical professionals for help, they tried asking medical students? Maybe a student, someone more open-minded and not so set in their ways, would be more willing to test out a theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy. Dan agreed. It was a long shot, a final Hail Mary, but it was definitely worth a try. They reached out to the University of Wisconsin, and this time their desperate plea actually worked. On the 4th of April 2018, about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they had contacted agreed to analyze it. And after the analysis was complete, the results determined that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out that Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians at the time didn't believe that cats could even catch the specific strain of strep that affects humans, let alone transmit it back to them. That's why all the professionals had refused to even test the family's cat. It went against everything they had been taught. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin's veterinary school that a student finally agreed to run the test. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain of strep bacteria that the family kept catching. Their beloved cat was the carrier, constantly reinfecting them after every round of antibiotics. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would go on to make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after one final round of antibiotics, this time including a dose for the cat, and one last deep clean of the house, the family's nightmare with strep throat finally went away for good. On the 30th of September 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband just outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, the key trembling slightly in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. Charlotte was here because of a sudden and terrible tragedy. Both of her parents had passed away just a few days ago. They had only been 70 and 76 years old, and by all accounts, they had both been in good health for their age. The story she had been told was as shocking as it was tragic. Her father had apparently suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. And then, when her mother found him, the shock of it all was so great that she also had a heart attack and collapsed beside him. Charlotte's mother had managed to make a call to a doctor just before she passed, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Both of them were gone. Now, Charlotte and her husband didn't live in Germany. They had flown in that morning all the way from their home in Wisconsin. And up until this point, Charlotte had been trying to hold her emotions together, to be strong through the travel and the initial arrangements. But now, standing inside her parents' living room, surrounded by all of their familiar belongings, the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had owned for years, it was like a dam inside of her just broke. All of the grief and shock she had been holding back just poured out of her, and she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, not really knowing what else to do, gently guided her over to the couch. He turned on the television to a quiet program, hoping it might be a small distraction, and told her to just sit down and rest for a bit before they had to think about dinner. They actually had plans that evening. The next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had been friends with her parents for years, had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. Charlotte's uncle, Dear, who lived nearby, also planned to come over after dinner to be with them. About 30 minutes later, while Charlotte was still sitting on the couch trying to compose herself while watching TV, Caroline, the neighbor, showed up at the door. She came in with 2 big bags full of groceries and, without any fuss, went right into the kitchen and began to cook. Pretty soon, the entire apartment, which had felt so empty and sad, was filled with the smell of comfort food cooking on the stove. It made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a little bit better. Eventually, Caroline called out from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready. So Charlotte got up from the couch, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the small dining table next to her husband. After Caroline served the food, the 3 of them began to eat together while they waited for her Uncle Dear to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dear did arrive. He walked up to the front door of the apartment and knocked. He waited for a full minute, but nobody came to the door. Thinking maybe they hadn't heard him, he knocked again, louder this time. But still, there was no answer. This was strange. Through the door, Dear could hear the sound of the television playing in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices, no conversation, no sound of anyone moving around inside. After a couple more minutes of waiting and knocking, he decided he would just let himself in. The door was unlocked. As Dear walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, for her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the noise from the TV. An uneasy feeling started to creep over him. This was very weird. They were expecting him, so where was everybody? He walked out of the living room and headed towards the kitchen, where a light was on. And there, he saw them. Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline were all sitting at the kitchen table. But something was terribly wrong. All 3 of them were just sitting there, motionless. Their plates of food were half eaten in front of them. But nobody was moving. Nobody was talking. It was like they were frozen in time, all just staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. Dear, confused and concerned, walked closer. He bent down and spoke to his niece. "Charlotte? What's going on? What are you guys doing?" But when he got a good close look at Charlotte's face, and then at Caroline's face, and her husband's face, his stomach just dropped. A wave of pure horror washed over him, and he stumbled backwards away from the table. What Deer saw in that kitchen was so terrifying, so eerie, and so awful, it would actually make international news. And that apartment would forever be known by a chilling nickname, the Death House. It turned out Charlotte's parents had not died from spontaneous heart attacks on the same day. That's not what happened at all. The tragic truth was that toxic, odorless sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe under the kitchen sink. That silent, invisible gas had poisoned both of Charlotte's parents, causing their hearts to stop at almost the same time. Because no one suspected poisoning, nobody thought to check for a gas leak. So, when Charlotte and her husband arrived from Wisconsin, they came to stay in her parents' apartment without any idea that the air inside was still filled with that same deadly gas. And so, as Charlotte, her husband, and their kind neighbor Caroline sat down for dinner in the kitchen, right near the source of the leak, the gas slowly poisoned them as well. When Deer finally came over, he found them all sitting around the kitchen table, frozen in their last moments, because they were already gone. Fortunately, Deer's instinct after seeing the horrific scene was to immediately get out of the apartment and go call the authorities. It was that single, quick decision that ultimately saved his life. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 stories disturbed you the finest. Was it the man whose skull was slowly disappearing without him even realizing it? The family that kept getting mysteriously sick because the source of the infection was sleeping in their own home? Or the apartment where people unknowingly sat down for dinner inside a room that was silently killing them? And remember, some of the most terrifying things in the world don't look dangerous at all until it's already too late. If you want another story that will stick in your head long after the video ends, there's a full playlist waiting for you right now. See ya!